We're fortunate to be joined by three thought-provoking speakers. Dr. Chris Keefer, a nuclear energy advocate, physician, and the host of Decoupled podcasts, bringing sharp insight into the role of nuclear power in meeting global energy and climate demands. Aidan Morrison, Director of Energy Research at the Centre of Independent Studies, known for his data-driven approach to public policy and national strategy. And Tom Swtitzer, Executive Director at the Centre of Independent Studies and one of Australia's most respected commentators on politics, economics and international affairs. Together, they will explore the intersection of energy, geopolitics and investment ring, all crucial factors in our risk sector as we navigate a changing global landscape. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage for what promised to be a fascinating and timely discussion. Enjoy the forum and welcome to Kalgoorlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and on behalf of Chris and Aidan, can I also thank Suzanne, Miles and Dealers and Diggers for having us here in Kalgoorlie this week. It's so self-evident that the mining and resources sector is crucial to Australian security and prosperity, and also Indigenous employment in remote communities, which makes it a great shame that too many people on the East Coast, especially in those former safe liberal metropolitan well Hill seats, they don't appreciate the good work that you do. But Chris and Aidan and I certainly do, which makes it a great pleasure to be here. So thank you very much. We all too often hear that the energy transition is well underway, but the cold, hard reality is that this energy transition is meeting serious roadblocks. And indeed, just this weekend, the veteran Western Australian journalist and editor, Paul Murray, wrote a column in the West Australian, and he said, quote, "Anywhere you choose to look, evidence is mounting that Labor's renewable energy transition policy is a failure." And Paul Murray goes to great lengths to quote Ross Garnaut, Professor of Economics and widely known as the godfather of Labor's energy transition. And Garnaut just last week, Professor Garnaut said that Australia, quote, "is currently on a trajectory to miss its renewable targets by a big margin." And Professor Garnaut goes on to say, "We are heading for a climate and energy policy crisis within a few years." And that's because the rollout of all the wind and solar projects hit the wall last year, and this is Garnaut's point, right at the time they needed to be supercharged to meet Labor's goal of 82% renewables and electricity by the end of the decade, by 2030. And then you think about the huge blowout in the estimated cost of the VNI West transmission line in Victoria. Get a load of these costs. Its price tag is expected to double to $7.6 billion, but could almost triple to $11.4 billion. And that's precisely why so many players in the energy policy debate are anxious. Outgoing Rio Tinto boss Jacob Straussholm says, "Our energy prices are incompatible with local manufacturing." Origin Energy CEO Frank Calabria, "There is a great risk of losing public support for the energy transition, along with rising impact on consumer bills." And that's not to mention the geopolitical risks involved with the energy transition. This is Jenny George, a long-time leader of the ACTU, prominent union leader who was for a time a federal Labor MP. Jenny George says, "In a climate of geopolitical instability, we've embarked on an energy transition that's almost totally dependent on imported renewable infrastructure." And yet, just today, front page story of the Australian newspaper, they say that the Prime Minister has been given a green light to turbocharge the energy transition, and it cites a Productivity Commission report just released last week that urges the government to take stronger action across electricity, heavy industry, transport and housing sectors to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. So Aidan, given everything I've just said then, and given Canberra's attempts to turbocharge the energy transition, is it conceivable we could meet those energy targets by 2050?
No, absolutely not. There is now there is no serious intellectual defence for the prospect that we would meet the net zero targets in 2050. It's just simply impossible, even if we had the right investment. But I'd like to point out, though, Tom, is that the characterisation of this energy transition meeting resistance, I don't think is quite right. I think the energy transition, it died. If building grid-scale wind and solar is what we're talking about, it stopped cold stone dead. A year or two ago, maybe even just before Roscano said, it is now starting to show signs of life, but that is only because it has been forcibly, completely intubated and resuscitated by the force of government subsidies. And this is something that I'd been trying to get through to the general public for some time, but finally Roscano as well, last week, has admitted that there are basically virtually no projects proceeding at the moment that don't depend on government subsidies from a federal or state level. And I think that there is now one example I just want to highlight here because it shows what it looks like to have a resuscitated zombie coming back to life, the dead starting to walk again. And that is an investment where I think we can see for the first time the banking sector, big bankers, investors, having bought the bullshit from the politicians about there being money in renewables. And that is from HMC Capital, who borrowed about $1 billion in promised money, future deferred earnings, to invest in a huge portfolio of development projects for wind and solar. And the previous owners of this were struggling to make 10% returns, and they boldly said to their shareholders that they could get 20% returns. And 6 days after they acquired this portfolio, Chris Bowen announced one of their pipeline projects to be the recipient of about $1 billion, roughly, of future subsidies. And then 6 months later, they still could not raise the funds to settle on the deal that they had signed. And since then, they've had a 1 month extension, and it should be any day now that we'll find out whether they can actually close that deal. And Chris Bowen has since announced again an extension to the subsidy scheme that will lavish all their other pipeline projects, probably with billions of dollars too. So that, at the moment, is what the energy transition looks like, is that it's been so badly calculated that it's thought that you can make money out of this. But there is now, honestly, not a single honest dollar of profit to be made in the renewable energy generation sector.
But the Labor government won a sweeping election victory on May 3. Usually first-term governments go backwards. This was a sweeping mandate for renewable energy, according to the Energy Minister. And he says that during the course of the next term, so the next 3 years till 2028, this is Minister Bowen's argument, we'll likely see renewables pass coal, quote, as our biggest source of electricity and then surpass 50% of our energy. To the extent that he's right, that indicates that the transition's going reasonably smoothly.
I think the truth begs to differ, unfortunately. At the moment, there is just no chance that we could physically meet the 2030 target of 82% renewables.
Just clarify that 82% renewables is in the electricity grid, right?
That's right.
It's not the overall energy mix.
That's right. So the electricity grid is maybe 30% of the overall energy, and we just got about 40% of our electricity, so about 11-12% of our overall energy is where we're currently at. And he wants to be double that, 80% renewable for electricity. But then after that, the idea is that we can go to more or less all our energy from renewable energy.
But I mean, I'm assuming that a lot of the renewable enthusiasts are also taking into account the real prospect that there could be technological breakthroughs for battery and storage.
I think that at the moment, the technological breakthroughs, I mean, costs would have to come down just so far. I mean, one example that might be given is what's happened with hydrogen. You can look at the recent deal, again, that Orica has accepted here. This is the first time we've got a subsidy where we can really put the tape measure across the scale of the subsidy and what's proposed to produce. And I think it just tells you everything you need to know about whether this is going to work or not. About a bit over $500 million to replace about 7.5% of Orica's gas requirements for their ammonia production at a particular site, okay? And that amount of subsidy, by the way, is not the $2 per kilogram of hydrogen that was originally promised. It's closer to $12. It's not the normal 30% of $30 a tonne for carbon abatement. It's about $1,100 or $1,200 per tonne abatement. To decarbonise just Orica's production at that site would cost about $6 billion. To reach what we want to do in the ISP by 2050 would cost $130 billion. Like, the scale of the subsidies required and the breakthroughs assumed here should put a nail in the coffin of the nonsense. And yet, for some reason, it's a large mining services company that's holding up Bowen's pants from above his ankles on this particular
We'll get to
topic.
renewables and net zero realism very soon, but let's bring in Chris Keefer, who's one of the world's leading experts on energy policy. He's got a very popular podcast. Chris, this conversation we're having about Australia's energy transition, it comes against a global backdrop of, according to many environmentalists, that we're facing a climate catastrophe or an emergency, increasing droughts, heat waves, floods, and other hazards of a warming planet. How worried are you about the effects of man-made global warming?
I mean, I think the debate has moved away from ideas of climate denialism towards, we all understand climate change is happening. And either you're concerned or you're a little on the complacent side. I think so far we've been very well insulated from the impacts of climate change, in part by Earth systems. The ocean is absorbing 90% of the heat and 30% of the carbon. Forests have been an effective carbon sink. So we've had a kind of shock absorber on the impacts that we've experienced. And I think no one in this room has really been materially impacted by climate change to date. I have to say I'm on the concern side of the spectrum looking forward. Other factors at play here, we've developed incredible infrastructure that's insulated us from climate change in terms of globalization, maritime trade. We really haven't had in the Western world, famines used to be common pre-1850s. There's been nothing like that outside of war and communism. But looking forward, I do think there's concerns in the possibility for nonlinear change and impacts. The Holocene, that geologic epoch, which brought about the agricultural revolution, has been good to us. So I think we need to be concerned. The question here is, what is the cost and efficacy of emissions reductions now versus what the damages will be later? And it depends a little bit on our discount rates and what you think of the current moment versus the value of a life for $1 100 or 200 years from now. I experience a certain amount of cognitive dissonance. Again, I am climate concerned, but I'm an energy realist. And in terms of the cost, it's looking like it's pretty extreme from what we're hearing in the Australian side of things. In terms of the efficacy, it seems quite limited, and we'll talk about net zero later. But ultimately, the levers of emissions reductions are not really in the hands of countries like Canada and Australia anymore. We account for 1% of global emissions respectively. China's 30%, right? The US is down at 13%. India's going to surpass that soon. So ultimately, we spend a lot of hot air talking about the issue, but we're not numerate about it. So that's kind of my call to action on this topic.
Okay, but since the Kyoto Protocol in late 1997, there have been nearly 30 UN global conferences designed to get a global pact to reduce emissions. And 10 years ago, there was the Paris climate change deal that was regarded as a historic breakthrough. This was President Obama at the time. Paris is a turning point for the world and the best chance we have to save the planet that we've got. And to be fair, 195 nations did acknowledge the problem of climate change and agreed to volunteer their carbon cutting promises to the IPCC every 5 years. What's the progress been like since, Chris?
I've been to a few of these Conference of the Party climate conferences around the world where the global elite get into their private jets and come and virtue signal, to put it generously. Listen, you mentioned Paris. Let's go back to Kyoto, the Kyoto Accords.
It was 1997.
1997. This was the first time that countries made binding commitments to emissions reductions. And when I say countries, I mean in the developed world. China was not on board at that point. They are maybe symbolically now. So what's happened since 1997, since these binding emission targets came into place? The share of global primary energy that we get from fossil fuels has dropped, 86% to 82%. But, and here's the big but, the absolute amount of fossil fuels we use has increased by 55%. And emissions have almost doubled from 20 gigatons in the year 2000 up to 37 now. So are we making progress? Absolutely not. Emissions are starting to plateau again in the developed world. The United States, a coal to gas transition is definitely underway. But we're seeing, again, skyrocketing emissions from developing countries.
You say that China's just symbolically going along with this, but Aidan, in fairness to China, I mean, they are the world's largest producers of wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles. When I worked at the ABC for many years in Sydney, my producers would say that China is leading the world in greening the world. Aidan.
Well, they're able to do that and produce the lowest cost solar panels and wind turbines of anyone because they unrepentantly burn coal in the processes that are required to do that. And we just can't.
A lot of it is our coal, presumably.
Well, actually, it's they have of their own coal about 5 times as much as we send to them, and we send a lot to them, right? So it is they burn a stupendous amount of coal, and I think the story of China is often misrepresented so badly because they're such a big country and they've been positioned themselves as a manufacturing powerhouse. So their energy needs are exploding, absolutely exploding. And every year they add an amount of wind and solar to their grid that makes, I suppose, environmentalists in the West absolutely swoon in admiration. But they also add a concurrent amount of coal capacity, and there's a bit of nuclear too to that. So really, they're repeating the honeymoon phase over and over again. They're not really shifting towards a dominated renewable energy sector. They're just adding a whole bunch on top of a massive bedrock of coal,
okay, but
and that's easy.
Chris, the New York Times, they say, and this is a fact, that China, I mentioned the wind turbines and the solar panels, but it also manufactures more electric cars, buses, motorcycles than any other country. The New York Times goes on to say, China also processes the vast majority of the world's cobalt and lithium essential components in the batteries that will help electrify everything from trucks to factories to advanced weaponry. In short, this is the New York Times, China holds the keys to the treasure chest of the renewable energy transition. Chris?
The question is, why? Is it out of climate motivation? They do have, a net zero commitment by 2060. Again, we'll talk about net zero lately. But what we have, I think, in the emergence between the United States and China is a petro-state on one side and an emerging electro-state on the other. Why is China pursuing electrification? They are still the world's largest importer of oil, 13 million barrels a day, 13% of the world's oil. And they're at extreme geopolitical risk of blockade. Should this Cold War get slightly hot, this new Cold War get slightly hot, just the prisoner of geography that China is, with that island chain and the Straits of Malacca bringing about 80% of their oil through, just threading the needle, and easily blockadable. So they're doing this for geopolitical reasons. And as Aidan mentioned, it's not just wind and solar and batteries. In Inner Mongolia, they're building what they call energy bases. So this is something like 6 gigawatts of solar, hundreds of square kilometers we're talking here. Similar amounts of wind, batteries, but also coal, mine mouth coal, 4 or 5 gigawatts. And what that allows, it's pragmatic for them. It is low cost, but again, with that key element of the coal, they send it down ultra high voltage transmission lines to Beijing, and the capacity factors that legitimate that investment in transmission are there because they're using them at a high value. And so again, why are they building so many electric vehicles? So they don't have to use as much oil, because that is a key geopolitical vulnerability that they have.
Aidan, the consensus in Canberra is that we should intensify military cooperation with Washington in the face of a rising and increasingly more assertive China. Is there a danger that we could be more dependent on China for renewables in the face of intensifying security competition, or have I just answered that question?
Like so many of these questions, once you ask the right question, it kind of self-answers a little bit because, unfortunately, the electronics and the wind and the inverters and all the transformers and the solar panels themselves, they're not extremely long-lived infrastructure in the sense that some other things like bridges and railways and certainly nuclear plants, which last 60, 80, maybe 100 years or so. So if you've got to replace it every 15 years and you've got such a tremendous bulk of it, we will be continually replacing. And I think that we have made ourselves
But aren't we in a good position to exploit the renewable revolution? The advocates for renewable energy, they say that Australia is a world leader in the deployment of wind and solar. Simon Holmes a Court, whom you've both debated at the past at CIS, our think tank, he says we've got, quote, boundless plains that are windswept and sun-drenched. And it's often said that Australia, unlike, say, Canada, it's always sunny somewhere. So doesn't that make us in a prime position to exploit renewables on our own?
Yeah, absolutely not. Unfortunately, the thing is with energy, more so than anything else, it's got a huge value if it's delivered at the right place and the right time. And so this idea that we have boundless planes to spare does not solve the problem as though we're some singular big bucket where as soon as it's sunny in some particular point, that is immediately shareable with absolutely everywhere in the continent. And so if you think about those examples, right, it's always sunny somewhere. What they mean is that when we have a nice big east coast low and all of New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria and Tasmania are covered in cloud and maybe it's cold and still, Queensland, upper North Queensland, which might still have them sun, will have enough sun, enough solar panels to provide the power for not just Queensland, but all the other states as well. And if you just think about that from a cold, hard engineering utilization of capacity perspective, it is absolutely bonkers to think that you have that much solar panels. What will they do the rest of the time when they're sitting around and it is sunny everywhere else? They will be totally unused. What about the transmission lines that we're now discovering cost 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times as much as we ever thought when we started telling us the story about, renewables with integration is actually low cost? That will be absolutely catastrophically underutilized if you try to build that national bucket that collects all the sun from distant parts and immediately shares enough of it to slosh around the country. That's not how an energy system works.
Chris, Australia and Canada have a lot in common. We're resource rich, for example. Tell us about Canada's experience with its transition, because not so long ago it was very popular in Canada to make that transition, especially to wind power. How's that process gone along?
Well, in my home province, we've had 2 transitions. One of them low cost, effective, resulting in an accidental decarbonization, which is the best kind when you don't even realize you're doing it. And that was the replacement of our coal fleet with nuclear, which had enormous benefits across the board. It meant that our coal workers transitioned seamlessly into even better jobs within the nuclear industry. It meant that our air pollution improved dramatically as a physician living through that. It was a unreservedly good thing. And it's equipped us very well to be energy resilient now. But we did embark on German Energiewende-inspired attempted green transition. The rationale for that was really quite lacking because we'd already essentially decarbonized our electricity, but put ideologues in power. And these are the kind of things that happen. So we had generous feed-in tariffs. The wholesale price of electricity was about 4 cents a kilowatt, and we were paying some solar developers 80 cents per kilowatt hour for that generation. And it really bankrupted us. So the total capital cost, inflation adjusted, of our nuclear fleet was about $63 billion. And what we have spent and will spend for these 20-year contracts, just 20 years, that is baked in ironclad contracts, is $65 billion. And so it's just a dramatic misallocation of resources, and it's really constrained what we can do going into the future. We are now leaning back into our nuclear advantage. The pendulum has swung. And as we anticipate demand is rising, data centers, AI, hopefully our economy doesn't get completely crushed by Trump, we're adding nuclear, and we're back on track. But it took a hard lesson, and it took the pendulum swinging one way.
And the lesson too is this fundamental misconception between the energy transition and the energy symbiosis.
Yeah, I mean, so this is perhaps a little bit more abstract and theoretical, but when we talk about this concept of energy transition, quite carelessly, without looking at the historical record, it simply doesn't match up. There is no historical precedent for one form of energy replacing another. And I'm going to give you a good mining example. So in the 1750s in Britain, 3 million cubic meters of wood were used in energy. 100 years later, when coal became the dominant source, were we no longer using wood anymore? No, we used 4.5 million cubic meters for pit props in mines to enable that coal extraction. So what you end up getting is more and more and more, and a symbiosis of the energies. Another example, in the mythology of this kind of stagist history of one energy form replacing another. When Ford came out with the Model T, you needed about 7 tons of coal for the steel in the car. And over the lifetime of that car, you'd use less than 7 tons of oil in it. And so again, you see this symbiosis over and over again. And yes, we have added an impressive amount of renewables around the world, but as you heard, since the Kyoto protocols have been signed, we use 55% more fossil fuels. And that's because, getting very abstract here, Homo sapiens is the fire ape. right? We do not evolve big brains, small jaws, and short guts without the mastery of fire, which occurred, in our ancestors, pre-sapiens ancestors. What I'll call Homo industrialis is absolutely tied in to the use of fossil fuels. They are not going to disappear. In the Western world, the example of Ontario, you will see things like, in isolated sense, a coal to nuclear transition. But again, globally, we've never used more wood or biomass or charcoal. We've never used more coal. We've never used more gas. Am I saying that right? We use more now than we ever have before. And so I anticipate that will occur into the future. And so this whole concept of energy transition is based on a mythology. And I think, again, the call here is towards numeracy and towards, a fundamental understanding and not being led astray by compelling, well-meaning narratives.
You say it's a mythology, but nevertheless, the consensus in Canberra and indeed across all the states, including our home state of New South Wales, Aidan, is that the rollout of renewable energy has a lot of economic benefits, including cheaper energy. Now, Matt Keane, his role now is...
Chair of the Climate Change Authority.
Okay, now he was an energy minister in the New South Wales government before he became Treasurer.
That's right.
He says, because he introduced the flagship legislation a few years ago.
That's right.
Now, he says the rollout is expected to deliver, quote, some of the cheapest electricity prices for industry in the entire OECD, turning New South Wales into an economic and energy superpower. And he emphasises the word affordability.
That's right. And so I think that this is a perfect example of the narrative we've been sold, because this narrative was sold to transition toward renewables. It wasn't just because decarbonisation was an imperative. It was always that message that this is also economically beneficial as well. There is a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. So we're getting that. It's not simply all about the decarbonisation.
Because it's cheaper, right? That's the argument.
Well, that was the argument back then. But what has happened since Matt Keane introduced his signature push, all the renewable energy zones in New South Wales, which was the second reading speech that you mentioned there, is that in the regulator's cap, it's called the default market offer, it's their assessment of what is the max price you'd have to pay for electricity. New South Wales had the largest increases out of all the states that were assessed in that document, the very largest. And the reason for that is, it's a couple of percentage points higher than South Australia and Queensland, is because it's the first time ever that the consumer has been sent the bill for exactly that piece of legislation, the New South Wales roadmap. And it included about $500 million to pay for these renewable energy zones that have not yet been built. So we have, in this case, the exact inversion of what Matt Keane hoped would happen, which is really, really low-cost economic advantage for New South Wales. Now, the actual reality is that as soon as the bill gets sent for that same piece of legislation, New South Wales is heading towards being at a disadvantage economically. And the incredible, most amazing thing about that whole story is that not only do we see it not panning out the way that it was said, but Matt Keane has told us, and this should have been frankly his last day in office, the 4th of November, he explained to a Senate committee in intricate detail when challenged with all the contrary evidence. He explained that he depended on the Australian energy market operators' advice and assessment that this was cheaper than any other alternative. And he had that absolutely exactly wrong. The market operator has never actually done that experiment and never tested that. And if the media had been on top of it and digested all the thousands of pages in the integrated system plan, they would have rounded on Matt Keane, and I think that he would not be able to be appointed to a top climate job, having demonstrated that he had exactly the wrong idea about what the key documents were in this space. So I think the reality is coming back to mug us, and it's particularly mugged Matt Keane.
Okay, well, feel free to ask questions in the last 15 to 20 minutes of this session on renewables. But let's turn to nuclear energy because, Chris, you've done a lot of work on nuclear energy, and of course the federal coalition in the lead up to the May 3 election made nuclear energy a central plank of its public policy outlook. You're a supporter of nuclear energy. Oh, by the way, just in Canada, what's the story with nuclear? How much does nuclear make up in the Canadian market?
So across the whole country, 15%.
15%.
In my province, where basically it's all concentrated, 60%.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah. And as you know, there is a ban on having nuclear energy in this country.
I am aware.
That has been in place since, I think, the late 1990s.
Yeah.
So you're a supporter of nuclear energy, but am I right in saying you think nuclear has been overhyped for certain applications, and one of them is remote mining? Tell us more.
Yeah, that is correct. I spoke at the Minerals Week for the Minerals Council a few years ago, and one of the senior leaders was saying, listen, we want this ban dropped. We're not too sure about building big plants, but we see a role for so-called nuclear batteries. And this is this idea of a 10 megawatt nuclear reactor that can replace, say, a diesel genset. And it sounds great. The sales pitch is amazing. You roll up on a truck, deliver it, you plug it in, doesn't require any maintenance really or operators, and it's a fantasy. Again, so I'm popping a lot of balloons today. The issue with it is in part just logistical. I mean, what's unique about nuclear energy is radiation, right? And so even a small reactor produces an enormous amount of radioactive fission products, and it's dangerous. How do we make nuclear safe? Well, in terms of managing something like waste, we do it in large, centralized, gigawatt-scale facilities with dedicated staff and infrastructure. And despite the fact that standing next to unshielded nuclear waste would give you a lethal dose and kill you within seconds, not even a minute, no one has ever been injured by it. It's a bit like aviation. It's the safest way to make electricity. When you take managing nuclear waste out of a centralized facility and you scatter it all over the back acre in multiple countries around the world, that becomes a major, major logistical challenge. And essentially, the first miner that hypothetically would do this would find themselves running the first high-level waste facility in Australia. And we all know what happened at Kimba, right? So unfortunately, compelling narrative, but a non-starter. Where do I see the role for nuclear energy in mining? Well, I mean, look no further than Ontario. We have a grid with a solid foundation in nuclear energy, and we have large grid-connected mines in Sudbury and Timmins, and they use 60% nuclear energy for their operations. So I hate to say it, but the vendors and some of the trade associations are unfortunately selling a bit of a false hope there.
Aidan, I mentioned earlier that we had this recent election, and not surprisingly, the government and the enthusiasts for the renewable energy transition say that this was an emphatic rejection of the coalition's nuclear policy. But it is carbon-free nuclear, and I think something like the broad cross-section, 18 of the 2022 OECD countries have nuclear energy. We don't, obviously. Is the prospect of nuclear energy in this country just not conceivable anytime soon?
No.
And if that is the case, then doesn't that pose problems for your argument that we need to move away, or be less reliant on renewables?
Yeah, it certainly does if you want to decarbonise still, but that is, I think, now totally.
If you want to decarbonise, that is the mainstream view in Canberra.
That's right.
Both sides of politics are committed to decarbonising the economy.
That's right. So what we need to do is basically stop telling ourselves fairy tales, total fairy tales. And even though I think that there are some parts of the establishment that are being dragged, kicking and screaming, like the Productivity Commission, to sort of say, there will be a cost, right? That needs to be shouted from the rooftops, actually, that there is a cost to the approach we're currently taking, and we need to be clear-eyed about that. But the narrative always was this would cost us nothing. And I just want to emphasise that is, or better than nothing, this was going to make us money. That was the deal that was struck. The terms of the deal that was given to the Australian population was not how much do you want to pay to decarbonise, it was quick, hurry up and help us lead to become a superpower in this space. And so I think at the moment the question is, unfortunately, the electorate was given a difficult and somewhat technical question which they have difficulty trying to reach the truth. And there was a breakdown of truth on both sides. Who do you trust? There are certainly ways to quibble with some of the ideas on both sides. And I think what we learned is that in the absence of a clearly technically correct determination that the public can have confidence in, they side with conviction over correctness. And I think the Labor Party, truth be damned, looked very convicted about what they were saying. They said there was just nothing at all wrong with renewables. It was both cheaper and cleaner and faster. And so even though those things were patently and obviously not true, there is not a chance, as I said, even the workforce requirements. The report that was sponsored by the market operator said that to reach the 2030 targets, we would have to more or less double the entire energy sector workforce in the next 5 years. We'd have to triple the number of electrical engineers inside 4 years, right? This is stuff that you could not do outside sort of wartime labour market directions, and yet we're still sort of saying we're going to do it. So I think when we are mugged by reality, we realise that we can't go on. And at the moment, that looks like us limping along year by year saying we'll extend coal another year, extend it another 2. They'll become gradually less reliable. They'll also become gradually less economical, keeping limping along. But eventually, we'll be faced with reality, which is the current transition towards very, very high levels of renewables is definitely not expensive, even if it is physically possible. Sorry, it's definitely not cheap. It is extremely expensive.
Chris, many of the enthusiasts for renewable energies will say, and the energy transition generally, is that there are some rays of hope, good role models in Scandinavia, for example. Do we know much about the examples in Northern Europe that have helped accelerate efforts to decarbonise their economies?
Renewables in Scandinavia, you're largely talking about hydropower in Norway. So this is not what we're talking about, obviously, in Australia. But sure, if you have hydroelectricity, then you're well endowed. Although, you know, there has been a bit of a crisis in Canada. We're 65% hydroelectric as a country. And we are seeing droughts, which are dramatically limiting, you know, our reserves. And, you know, a province like Quebec, which is 95% hydroelectricity, they heat with it. If they don't hold back enough water, they freeze. I mean, it's minus 40 for weeks in Montreal, in the capital of Quebec. And so, you know, I don't think that's really the question. I mean, certainly Germany, if you want to talk about Northern Europe, they have spent on the order of 500 billion on a wind and solar transition. They are still heavily reliant on coal. And I mean, this is a country where your capacity factors for solar are something like 8 or 9%. And they have, you know, at last tally, what is it, 60, 70, 80 gigawatts? So just a dramatic misallocation of capital. They shut down their nuclear fleet. Regrettably, they were forced to extend it because of the Russian invasion and the shock of not having easy access to Russian gas. But I think Europe is really coming to its senses, and similarly to Australia, new investments in renewables have really stalled out, and that progress and rate of deployment, we're really seeing a plateau too.
If I could just point out there, I think that Germany now, there's a couple of weeks ago that a whole bunch of captains of industry, I think the leaders of ArcelorMittal, BASF, one of the major unions as well, one of the major miners and energy producers, wrote to the Chancellor and said, in their opening sentence it was, basically, this is the worst industrial crisis since World War II. And the rest of the letter laid the blame very squarely on the renewable energy transition that attempted. And so I just think that the jury is back in now. We know what it looks like to attempt that. And I think it's just bizarre that anyone else can seriously argue that there is a very, very high weather dependent, because hydro is an exception. Hydro, if you've got it, is really great. But the weather dependent energy powering industrial economy, I just think the jury is in. We know the answer to that question. It's just not going to happen.
What about hydrogen? I mean, we're all too often told we have this great potential in Australia to be a hydrogen superpower. And I know there have been setbacks with twiggy forests, among other things. But what about green steel or other possible applications? Is hydrogen completely dead, or has it just been misunderstood?
I'd love to take that question. I mentioned earlier we are homo industrialis, tied to fossil fuels. And that's because what Canadian energy expert Václav Smil refers to, we have 4 pillars of civilization, right? So steel, everything's made of it or with it. All your tooling machines, your lathes, your drills, milling machines, etc. Cement, ammonia, fertilizer. You know, without nitrogen-based fertilizers, we can only support a population of 4 billion on this planet. And lastly, plastics. What do these all have in common? They're the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors. And they're responsible for about 25% of emissions. And most of these processes are going up in carbon intensity as we shift production, deindustrialize the West, partially in the German case, due to botched energy policies, and move that production over largely to East Asia. Now, a hydrogen tie-in. So you guys have all heard of green steel, no doubt, right? And we have these breathless stories in the media about pilot projects which have no hope of scaling. So example here, 99 0.99994% of iron ore is reduced with coke, right? So we have a tiny, tiny contribution of hydrogen in a couple of these pilot projects, one of them in Sweden. If we were wanting to produce a new reducing agent, so replace coke with hydrogen, and we wanted it to be green hydrogen, how much energy would that take? How much electricity would we need to generate? 4,000 terawatt hours. To put that in perspective, that's the entire electricity production of the United States. Now, presumably, we're doing this with wind and solar. Each wind turbine that we put up, and we'd have to put up about 1.2 million, requires 500 to 1,000, or in the case of the really big wind turbines that China's starting to put out, 1,500 tons of steel. So we're just chasing our tail around and around. So this is what I'm saying. I think net zero and the pursuit of net zero is perhaps a noble goal, right? Because if in this beautiful world we were able to attain net zero, we would stabilize our global average temperatures, and that's something I would like to see. However, our commitment to it is utterly delusional, particularly ideas that we're going to get to it by 2050. And so this leads to massive misallocations of capital and really delays in doing what I think are the smart moves in terms of carbon emissions reduction, champion of nuclear right here, but also things like adaptation. That's taboo to talk about adaptation to climate change, to talk about geoengineering. And so we're delaying doing the research on it, delaying doing the infrastructure building that we need. And again, this is where net zero becomes a net harm when we have a collective delusion that we're all stuck in. And I think folks like Aidan and myself are able to stick our necks out on this issue and say the emperor is not wearing any clothes because we're not leaders of large mining companies, we're not politicians, we're not media personalities. Somehow we have the escape velocity to be able to again, be numerate and say the emperor's not wearing any clothes. And I do think that is going to become increasingly important. And for me, again, this isn't an argument that we do nothing to reduce carbon emissions, but it is an argument for realism, because a shared collective delusion is not going to create ideal and best policy.
And meanwhile, the lion's share of global emissions are clearly coming from the non-OECD, led by China and India. And, you can't fault these leaders. They want to grow their economies and reduce poverty, and the cheapest way of doing that, at least for the foreseeable future, is still on the back of carbon energy. I once tried to make that point on the ABC's Q&A, and I think I needed bodyguards to get out of the ABC after I made that point. Now it's time for Q&A, and feel free to put your hand up, and we've got roving mics. So anyone would like to ask a question to either Chris or Aidan. There's a question there. We've got a mic coming right to you. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Shane on here from Keynote. My question is, I attended an International Energy Agency forum last year, and they said that perhaps we should be looking at using more natural gas, so converting coal to gas. And I've noticed when we look at the consumption, it's actually gone down over the last decade of gas, and coal's actually risen. Do you see that as an alternative as part of this transition?
Look, if you want to reduce carbon emissions, then yes. In terms of per kilowatt hour of energy, gas, if it's burned in a big combined cycle thing, is roughly half the emissions of coal. So if you say a factor of 2 is worth aiming for, then you would say absolutely yes, I suppose. The problem we have, though, is that when you're still telling yourself that you're on the way to zero and you think that that is credible, you say, halfway is not good enough, let's not have that, please. And so I think that there is just a question there about what is the credible end point that you seriously think you are aiming for? And I think at the moment we've been told, basically, that there is such a catastrophe, we need to hit zero, and because it is so imminent and such a catastrophe upon us, because it's an existential risk, we can't even check the cost. We're not even going to look at what it costs to make those steps here, so which leads to catastrophic misallocation of capital, as I think I would agree with Chris.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the IEA has really become ideologically captured as well. And again, just to put a final sort of nail in the coffin of net zero, we have sort of 1 or 2 probabilistic models and pathways which do not get to net zero. We still get to, modest emissions with very generous assumptions. But organizations like the IEA, the IPCC, to brute force that curve down to zero, one of the things they depend upon is negative emissions. So this idea of bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. They anticipate that we would need between 1 to 3 Indias, the landmass of 1 to 3 Indias, devoted just to the cultivation of ultra-fast growing biomass, things like eucalyptus plantations, fertilized with that ammonia, again, 99.99% made by steam methane reforming and coal gasification. So it starts to give you a bit of an idea just how utterly delusional this whole thing is. So again, just I know I'm straying from your question, but the IEA is not what the IEA was 20, 30 years ago.
Okay, next question. Yes, I'll just wait for the mic to come down. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Philip, and I just have a simple question, and it's if net zero is not realistic, what is the ratio?
Sorry, couldn't hear that.
What is the...
If net zero is unrealistic, what
What is the ratio that's realistic?
is the ratio?
10% carbon emission, 20%? How
What
much?
is the goal? As not zero, but what could we aim for?
Yeah.
So there's a risk assurance organization advising the insurance industry called Det Norske Veritas. Some of you might be aware of it. And they're one of the agencies that has done, again, what they call a probabilistic approach to modeling climate emissions reductions. And so, they are generous in their assumptions about very large deployments of renewable energy, about energy efficiency, but they do not critically rely on things like degrowth, hydrogen, or carbon capture and storage. And so what they generously anticipate is by 2050, we will have reduced our use of fossil fuels and therefore emissions by about 1/3. And if you follow that trend along, you get to about 2.3 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, global average temperature, by 2100. What's interesting is if we, and I think this is more likely to happen, just plateau our emissions at the 37 gigatons a year that we currently do, we're going to hit that same temperature. What this exercise does is it delays us getting to what we'd otherwise get to, which is about 3 degrees, by about 49 years. And for me, that probably is relevant, but it still gives you a sense of realistically what's likely to happen. And I don't celebrate that. Again, I'm someone who's climate concerned, but again, I think we need to be realistic to not misallocate capital on this question.
I have another one, and it's a simple one again. So here we have a lot of gold miner, and obviously gold is at the record high. Does that give us an opportunity to try to make a difference?
To try to look at it.
I missed the gold bit, sorry?
So with the high price per ounce of gold at the moment.
High price of gold, yep.
Most gold or mining operations are remote and therefore are not connected to the grid. Therefore, we need to build our own power station.
Yeah.
In that current situation, do we have an opportunity to try something different and try to make a difference?
Try something different. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we are. We have Aggreko here, we have Zenith. I got to participate in the investors tour of the Super Pit yesterday. And, they are deploying hybrid systems with diesel and gas, as well as a large amount of wind, solar, and batteries. And, leaving aside the kind of energy culture wars and my bias towards nuclear, I have to admit that, the new operation at Dundee have cut their diesel use by 50%. And the Super Pit is going to, really reduce their OPEX. They're making a big, capital expenditure on this. And so, again, I think in the sort of mining microgrid environment, these sort of hybrid systems are, right now, according to Steve McCary, going from the napkin to deployment in 2 years, right? And so that's why, again, as much of a nuclear advocate as I am, microreactors are nowhere near prime time on that. And so that's the kind of nuance I have. I'm not sure, Aidan, how you feel about it.
Keen to bounce off that, Chris, because I think that I've been scathing of renewable energy and weather-dependent energy in general, and I think that there is a better use case than in the mainstream grid for more, as a larger share of energy replacement on these remote mine sites than there is anywhere else. And the reason for that is this: to get power, reliable power to a remote mine site, it's either diesel or gas, all right? Remote diesel is more expensive than normal diesel. Diesel is about, I don't know, probably a couple of times the price of gas. Gas is about 5 times the cost of coal. Coal is about twice the cost of brown coal. Brown coal is a similar cost to uranium. And so if you're on a remote mine site, it's going to make sense for you to spend a lot more on wind and solar to start pushing your fuel bill down than it ever would in a big consolidated grid that has access to things like coal and or uranium. So I think that that gives you a reasonable, if they get to 50, 60, 70%, that tells you that the stopping point for a big grid, a grid scale grid, is going to be a lot lower than that for your renewable energy. But to answer your question, what could we aim for net zero? I think the best chance of us reducing our carbon emissions would be to pretty much fix electricity, which might be done with nuclear. It would not realistically all happen by 2050, but that would be the best shot. And that is a cap of 30% reduction of our emissions. Once you go beyond electricity and you say, let's electrify everything else that we did for heat, and then you use hydrogen as a feedstock, the story we've been told depends absolutely 100% on electricity being stupendously abundant and virtually free. And we now know that electricity from integrated renewables is definitely not free. In fact, it's very expensive. So I would say to those plans, just stick $150 to $250 per megawatt hour in your electrify everything and hydrogenify everything models. It falls apart. So I think like 2050, back down to 70% of current emissions would be quite ambitious, but not insane.
Aidan, let's just step back briefly, put things in very simple terms in a global context. The global energy output. So 80 to 85% is still coal, gas, and oil.
That's
globally.
Right. Yep.
And the other 15% is nuclear, hydro, and wind and solar. And wind and solar make up about 5-6%.
Something like that. That's right.
And we're in 2025.
Yep.
And the goal is to get to 100% renewables by 2050 or 2060 for developing countries.
There's just no chance. Again, I mean, like it's still nice to say, it's popular in polite circles, but if you want to have your intellect respected, you cannot keep saying this nonsense, right? So it just will not happen.
Fascinating numbers, aren't they? Okay, next question. Yes, down there. We'll just wait for a roving mic. Oh, we've got one over there. And we move over here. Yep, just down there. Thanks, mate. And then we'll go to you. Yep.
Hi, I'm Bob Klein from the United States, and I just wanted to say how grateful I am to you guys for your sobriety to counteract what I consider just mass hysteria concerning the climate, and we're all concerned about it, but just tremendous. I walked in here with some trepidation, didn't know you gentlemen, and expected to hear the same narrative that I hear day in and day out, and it's just very refreshing. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your kind of hope for a more sober assessment going forward? Are there more people like you out there expressing a more rational view toward climate?
I think it's beginning. I think there'll be an ebb and a flow. And again, I think it's going to take people sticking their necks out a little bit to say the emperor's not wearing any clothes. And again, I am not someone who is climate complacent. I think this is going to be a growing concern. And the first degree of warming will not look like the second or third degree. This is not, when people talk about global average temperatures, they say, okay, if it's, 5 degrees this morning, it's 6 degrees, big deal, right? The Arctic is warming up dramatically faster, right? So, 2-degree rise in global average temperatures means 20 degrees in the Arctic, and it means a whole bunch of permafrost melts. It means methane gets released. So, again, I don't want to come across as a complacent on this issue. And I think there are things that we can do. I'm an emergency medicine physician by, I call it my night job. And I do, I have a media company and a nonprofit. That's my day job. And in emergency medicine, it's all about triage, right? So it's how do we mobilize our limited resources and time to have it's utilitarian, to have the greatest impact. And I think, again, having a sober analysis, as you said, and we were all breathalyzed before we came on stage today, can help identify what are the best and highest yield emissions reductions technologies. And also, again, we've got to start really thinking about adaptation, and I think really looking at geoengineering ultimately, because we are locked into this baby. we are not getting to net zero, and that means that the climate will continue to warm, and while it may not be a big issue for you and I in our lives, eventually I think it's going to become a big issue.
Okay, Aidan.
Yeah, I think that triage analogy is crucial. Not misallocating your capital, not spending lots of money, including future taxpayers' money, on stuff that will not and cannot get the race complete. So I just want to take the opportunity to mention one absolutely no-brainer excellent thing that can help reduce emissions reductions in an economically viable way, and that is to mine uranium and lift the freaking ban in Western Australia. Because at the moment there is still basically a policy ban on mining uranium, which is one of the least intrusive, most safe, most low energy ways of extracting any ore from the ground. And what it produces is just, I think, the very, very best hope we have to decarbonize the electricity sector globally. So if there's one practical takeaway, I just want to sort of say that is my number one easiest recommendation.
It's entirely unlikely with Labor in Canberra and in Perth.
That Western Australia can do it. I just think that people, it's just a policy ban. It just requires a decision, and they could do it very.
Chris, quickly, and then we'll go to the next
if
question.
I can just build off that quickly. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, and I understand that it's gone up in smoke now, but about Australia becoming a hydrogen exporter, a green energy superpower, the Saudi Arabia of hydrogen, right? And it's ignoring the fact that you already are a clean energy superpower in terms of your exports. So 1/2 of Australia's emissions are offset by its uranium exports, which are used around the world instead of a mix of coal and gas. Your entire coal fleet's emissions are essentially offset by the uranium that you export, and in 2005 you exported a whole lot more, right? So hopefully, God willing, sense will return, and you'll be able to contribute more.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jess Furtick. I'm here representing Auzorum. Thank you so much for your panel discussion. It was so interesting and gave such a realistic view on the energy crisis that we're facing. So I'm originally from South Africa, and we have a lot of energy problems over there with Eskom and a lot of load shedding. So I have a lot of family over there, so quite invested in that, but outside of the Australian crisis. So my question is, given that we're integrating more renewable energy into the grid, but we're still, seeing a huge increase in fossil fuel burning, isn't it still a net positive that we've got renewables in the grid, given there's such a huge, demand for energy? So is it still a net positive in your view? And should we start to see, or start to view energy transition more as like energy addition from a renewables perspective?
I think, for the example of Ontario, we've installed about 3 gigawatts of solar, and frankly, for Ontario, that's too much. There is a logical amount of solar where it has real value. We peak in the summer, and our summer heat waves, we need lots of juice, and solar is fairly reliable in that season. Unfortunately, it's completely absent for about 4 months of the year, and if we do transition to heat pumps and winter heating, it has incredibly low value. So we have to look at not just what the capacity factor is, but the capacity value. And so, I'm not a zealot who's anti-solar. There's a place for it, and there's a place for a certain percentage of it where it contributes constructively to your grid. But there is definitely the danger of misallocation of capital, like beating that as a dead horse, when you're just pursuing it as an ideological goal. We're going to achieve X% renewables by X dates. That is a real problem. We need to be numerate and data-driven.
I think I have a stronger view. I've been thinking about what is there to celebrate, or what is good about adding some more renewable energy to the mix. Is not there some good amount? And the more I go and look at the kind of pure economic lens of how much is the optimal amount to include in that mix, the lower my number keeps on going, unfortunately. And that's because the cost of system is often driven by the weakest link, the peak of demand. And to really reduce system costs, you have to be able to reliably bring down your worst peak at a particular location. And so even on hot days in Sydney, for example, it might be good to think, okay, it's warm, it's sunny, but then we have these, on the muggiest and hottest days, like huge winter storm clouds, pretty much, not winter, summer storms roll in and block out the sun over the city for all the rooftop solar. And so there has to be something there right then. So You have to reliably bring down your peak demands, and wind and solar, they just don't do much. That's the thing about them, they're not controllable. So I think my optimal amount, there could still be a place for a little bit, but it's not a big bit, on the economics strictly. If you then start to think outside of the pure, strict economic optimization and say, what is the other impacts of wind and solar, and you think about the environmental impacts and the social impacts, the more and harder I look there, I think that we have completely deluded ourselves into thinking there is no other environmental and social impacts from these things. And it comes down to the fact that they are just so massively big and dispersed. They require so much exposure to the land area and the sky area of these turning turbines. And so when you go to the rural communities who are proposed to have, in Coolah, New South Wales, I visited not long ago, but it's a town of rolling hills. There's sort of 250 metre high sort of valleys and farmlands in between. And the top of the ridgeline's the hardest to farm. They have all the kind of corridors of the native growth. And the plan is to cover the tops with 250 or 270 metre high turbines above. So imagine that, rural village, all the valleys now have stacked on top of them an extra 250 metres of industrial machinery. And you sit into the town hall meetings of these whole communities, and if I could take a moment of the vibe in that room where you have the whole town sort of turned out, speech after speech, some people in tears explaining what's going on. If you could take a little drip of that and inject that into the lower North Shore of Sydney, this job would be done. The country does not like this stuff. The impact it has, everyone who benefits has to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which means they can't even talk to their friends about what they're doing and what they signed on to. So the division, the impact, the environmental impact, blowing up the Great Dividing Range in Queensland. Like again, there are a whole bunch of places. There's no wind in Queensland, except on the top of the ridgeline, which is just where the rain falls, and on one side of its World Heritage Area, where tropics, just on the other side, they are blasting up ridgelines to create wind turbine towers. It's just not ecologically good either.
Aidan, Chris, we are out of time, but I think this discussion has been very important because it comes at a time when that Canberra consensus on net zero, and the Liberal Party is still very much committed to the net zero targets by 2050. And as I mentioned in my introduction, the front page of the Australian today makes it very clear that Canberra is likely to turbocharge that energy transition. So it's important to hear counter-arguments. One of our intellectual heroes at the Centre for Independent Studies, where Aidan and I work, and we brought Chris out to Australia last year, one of our intellectual heroes was the 19th century liberal intellectual John Stuart Mill. And he famously said, "He who knows only his own side of the argument knows little of that." And what John Stuart Mill meant was that only when you know your opponent's strengths do you understand your own side's weaknesses. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to the climate debate, whether it's in Canberra, Perth, Sydney, Melbourne especially, but all across much of the OECD, you rarely hear the counter-arguments, and the counter-arguments deserve to be heard. So with that in mind, please join me in thanking Chris Keefer and Aidan Morrison.
Great panel, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks for chairing that, Tom, and thank you as well to Chris and Aidan for a very informative session. Now, we're just about to break for morning tea, so everybody's welcome to meet in the marquee. Thanks for joining the first session.